You want to know the strangest thing about that day? The old ranger would say years later. Not one of those men tried to run. Arizona, late summer, 1944. The desert stretched flat and endless beneath a white sky that seemed too large for the earth. Heat shimmered above the highway like invisible water, bending the horizon into wavering shapes that came and went with the wind. A military transport truck moved slowly along a narrow desert road, its engine humming in the dry afternoon air. Inside the open-back truck sat 40 German prisoners of war, their gray uniforms faded by months under the American sun. Dust clung to their boots. Sweat darkened the collars of their shirts. No one spoke. They had been ordered onto the truck that morning without explanation. No work tools. No warning. Just a quiet command from an American guard and the rumble of the engine starting beneath them. Karl Muller sat near the back of the truck, one hand gripping the wooden rail as the road curved through miles of desert. He was 29 years old, once a mechanic in Cologne, now prisoner number 81427 at a camp outside Flagstaff. He had spent nearly a year in captivity, long enough to learn certain patterns about the Americans who guarded them. Americans explain things. Americans like paperwork, schedules, rules. But today there had been no explanation at all. Just the truck. Just the road heading west into the empty land. Across from him, another prisoner leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. "Do you know where we're going?" Karl shook his head once. The man glanced toward the soldiers riding in the front of the truck, then lowered his voice even further. "Someone said they're taking us deeper into the desert." The rumor moved through the prisoners like a faint wind. Not panic, just quiet uncertainty. A third man muttered that perhaps they were being transferred to another camp. Another said the Americans needed labor crews somewhere farther south. But the road kept going, and the landscape offered no clues. Only sand-colored rock, scattered shrubs, and sky so wide it made the men feel smaller with every mile. Karl studied the soldiers seated in the cab ahead of them. 2 American guards rode there beside the driver. One rested his elbow out the open window, cigarette smoke trailing behind the truck in a thin, gray ribbon. They looked relaxed, bored even. That detail stayed with Karl. If something serious were happening, soldiers usually carried a certain tension in their shoulders. These men did not. The truck climbed slowly onto higher ground. The air shifted. A breeze moved through the open truck bed, cooler than before. The road curved along a ridge of red stone. Still no fences. No buildings. No guard towers. Just desert and sky. One prisoner wiped dust from his glasses and squinted toward the distance. "There is nothing here," he murmured. The truck continued another mile. Then 2. The engine downshifted as the road began to rise sharply. Karl noticed something strange then. The American driver slowed the vehicle almost to a crawl, as if the road ahead required caution. The truck rolled forward until it finally stopped. The engine fell silent. No one spoke. A moment later, one of the American guards stood up and stepped toward the back of the truck. He looked at the prisoners calmly, almost casually, as if this stop were the most ordinary thing in the world. Then he said in clear English, "All right, gentlemen, step down carefully." The prisoners climbed out one by one onto solid ground. Boots touched warm stone. The wind felt different here. Cooler, stronger, carrying the faint echo of something distant. Karl stepped down last. For a moment, he saw nothing unusual. Just rock and sky and a narrow dirt trail leading forward. Then one of the prisoners walked a few yards ahead and suddenly stopped. Completely still. Another man followed and froze the same way. Karl took 3 steps forward, and the earth disappeared. Karl Muller took one more step, and the world opened beneath him. The ground did not slope gently the way hills usually did. It simply stopped. One moment there was stone beneath his boots, the next there was nothing but space. He froze instinctively, his hand tightening on the strap of his cap as a powerful wind rose from somewhere far below. At first his eyes struggled to understand what he was seeing. The landscape was too vast, too layered, too immense for the mind to accept in a single glance. Walls of red stone stretched outward in impossible distances, folding into one another like waves frozen in time. Ridges and cliffs dropped thousands of feet into a labyrinth of shadow and sunlight. Somewhere far below, a thin silver ribbon twisted through the canyon floor. The Colorado River. Though from where Karl stood it looked no wider than a thread. For several long seconds none of the prisoners spoke. 40 men stood in a loose line near the edge of the trail, their boots planted firmly on the stone as though the ground itself might suddenly disappear. The desert wind moved through them, carrying the dry scent of rock that had been baked under the sun for thousands of years. One prisoner removed his cap slowly. Another man rubbed his eyes as if the image before him might vanish if he blinked. Carl heard someone whisper behind him in German, very quietly, almost reverently. This cannot be real. The canyon stretched nearly a mile across in places, with cliffs dropping more than 4,000 feet toward the river below. The scale of it defeated ordinary language. There were no buildings here, no machines, no human marks at all. Just stone, sky, wind, and time. Carl stepped closer to the edge, careful with each movement. The wind grew stronger as he approached, lifting the edge of his shirt and tugging gently at his sleeves. He could hear it now, moving upward through the canyon walls like the distant breath of the earth itself. Somewhere far below, unseen birds rode the currents of air, their shadows gliding silently across the cliffs. A prisoner beside him leaned forward and then stepped back again quickly, shaking his head. "How deep is it?" he asked aloud. No one answered at first. Then one of the American guards spoke from behind them in a calm voice. "About a mile down in some places." The prisoners turned slightly at the sound. The guard stood several yards away with his hands resting loosely on his belt. There was no tension in his posture, no command in his voice, only quiet certainty. Another prisoner frowned toward the horizon. "Who built it?" he asked. The American guard almost smiled. "Nobody built it," he said. "The river carved it. Took about 6 million years." The number drifted through the air like something impossible. 6 million years. Carl tried to imagine such a span of time and failed immediately. 6 million years was longer than any kingdom, longer than any war, longer even than the oldest stories men told about the world. The prisoners slowly spread along the trail, each man searching for his own place to stand and look. Some knelt near the stone edge, studying the layered colors of the cliffs that ranged from deep rust red to pale sandstone and purple shadow. Others simply stood still, their eyes moving across distances so wide they had no clear end. Carl noticed something unusual then. No guards had raised their voices. No rifles were pointed. No one ordered them to stay in formation. The Americans had simply allowed them to step forward and see. He glanced back toward the trail where the transport truck waited. The driver leaned casually against the side of the vehicle, lighting another cigarette, as if this entire moment were routine. Carl turned again toward the canyon. The wind lifted slightly, brushing across his face with surprising coolness despite the desert heat. From somewhere down within the canyon came the faint echo of moving water, a sound so distant it felt almost imaginary. Carl found himself breathing more slowly now. Not from fear, from something else entirely, something closer to awe. For months he had believed the world had grown smaller because of war. Borders, camps, barbed wire, guards. Orders shouted across narrow spaces. Yet here the earth opened wider than anything he had ever imagined. A prisoner standing beside him whispered again, this time almost to himself. "Germany has mountains," the man said quietly. "But nothing like this." Carl nodded slowly. There was nothing in Europe that could prepare a man for such scale. Nothing that made a human being feel so small and so strangely free at the same time. He looked down again at the distant ribbon of the Colorado River winding through the canyon floor and wondered, not for the first time since the truck had stopped, why the Americans had brought them here at all. Carl Muller remained near the edge longer than most of the others. The wind moved steadily through the canyon, rising from somewhere deep below and brushing across the rim with a coolness that surprised him. In the desert air he had grown used to heat that pressed down from above, but here the air seemed to breathe upward from the earth itself. The sensation made the place feel alive. Around him the prisoners continued to move slowly along the stone trail, each man exploring the view in quiet disbelief. No one laughed. No. One spoke loudly. Even the men who normally argued about everything now seemed reluctant to disturb the silence. The canyon demanded a certain respect. Carl watched a shadow drift across one of the far cliffs. At first he thought it was a cloud, but when he looked higher he saw a bird gliding through the air currents, wings outstretched and motionless. It circled once above the canyon wall and then disappeared into the distance. "An eagle," someone said quietly behind him. Carl nodded without turning. The bird had looked impossibly small against the enormous landscape. Everything here felt reduced in scale. Human voices. Human worries. Even the war itself seemed strangely distant standing on that rim. A few yards away, two prisoners crouched near the stone edge, studying the layers of rock that formed the canyon walls. One pointed toward a band of pale stone halfway down the cliff. Different layers, he said slowly. Like pages in a book. The other man ran his fingers across the rough surface of the rock beneath them. A very old book, he replied. The American guard who had spoken earlier stepped forward along the trail. He was not much older than Carl, perhaps in his early 30s, with sunburned cheeks and the relaxed posture of someone who had spent years outdoors. He carried no rifle in his hands now. It rested casually against his shoulder by a strap. If you look across there, he said, gesturing toward a distant ridge, that formation is called the Vishnu Schist. Some of those rocks are nearly 2 billion years old. The number drifted into the air and settled among the men like another piece of the landscape. 2 billion years. Carl repeated the number silently in his mind and found that it meant almost nothing to him. Human history barely stretched beyond a few thousand years. Even the oldest buildings in Europe felt young compared to what the guard was describing. Another prisoner spoke hesitantly. You brought us here just to see this? The guard shrugged slightly, as though the answer required no explanation. Some people think everyone should see it at least once. The simplicity of the answer unsettled Carl more than any elaborate speech might have done. We usually reduce things to rules and commands. Yet there was no rule that said prisoners needed to stand on the rim of one of the largest natural wonders on Earth. And still the Americans had driven them here. Carl walked a few steps farther along the trail where the stone curved outward in a broad ledge. From this angle the canyon seemed even wider. Layer after layer of cliffs stretched toward the horizon, fading from deep red into pale orange and finally into soft blue where distance swallowed the details. The Colorado River shimmered faintly nearly a mile below, twisting through the canyon floor like a narrow ribbon of moving light. The scale made Carl dizzy if he stared too long. He stepped back and sat on a flat rock near the trail. For several minutes, he simply listened. Wind. The faint rustle of boots on gravel. Somewhere above them the cry of another bird echoing across the canyon walls. No engines. No shouting. No sound of barbed wire gates opening or closing. Sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, and the light across the canyon shifted with every passing minute. The cliffs that had looked bright red earlier in the afternoon now deepened into darker shades of copper and rust. Long shadows stretched across the canyon walls, turning the vast landscape into a pattern of light and darkness that seemed to move even though the stone itself had not changed for millions of years. Carl noticed that the wind had strengthened slightly. It rose steadily from the depths below, cool and steady against his face. He could feel it tug gently at the sleeves of his shirt and lift small grains of sand along the trail behind him, looking directly at anyone. I stood right about where you were standing now. A prisoner near him glanced over with curiosity. You grew up here?